Story 1. Stephen Baldwin and Chad Michael Murray both tried to get things for free and used the "do you know who I am" tactic for something that was $5. Baldwin also gave his number to a teenage coworker, and we called it to see if it was real, not even thinking about caller ID. He spent the next year randomly calling her. My favorite celebrity encounter was making a smoothie for Gordon Ramsay. He was super nice and said he would be back later to get his friend something. The friend was David Beckham, who was also super nice, and they stayed and took pictures with everyone. Story 2. I used to live in the same city as Tommy Lee Jones, and there was a point in time where if you worked in the service industry, you either had your own story about him or knew someone who did. I have a few of my own. Celebrity or not, he is hands down one of the rudest people I've ever come across. Very demanding and hateful. He looks down on service workers and treats them poorly, but at the same time expects them to simultaneously know who he is, not acknowledge who he is, but give him special treatment because of who he is. Story 3. Tommy Lee Jones was awful. I worked with him doing press on a film he was in, and we had to keep him supplied with alcohol to even acknowledge the reporters. He would also grope the female staffers regularly. Just nasty. Story 4. Got a call to David Spade's room at like 2 a.m. because he had issues with his Wi-Fi. When I told him I couldn't fix it and he had to wait for information technology in the morning, he said in the most deadpan David Spade way, "I figured you wouldn't be able to fix it. I didn't figure they put their best and brightest on the graveyard shift." Laughter. Story 5. Two gems and a horror. Judi Dench, who was lovely, had quite a twinkle in her eye and was just totally charming. Just as you'd imagine and hope her to be. Going back a long time, in the early 1990s, I had a friend in London who was HIV positive. He was in the hospital and very, very unwell. It wasn't really thought he'd be alive for more than a month or two. The hospital staff was lovely and visiting was pretty much as and when, just as long as you were quiet if it was late. I'd gone to visit him after a very long workday and was gowned up and chatting quietly with him. It was probably around midnight when one of the nurses asked if he was up to another visitor, which he was. Princess Diana turned out to be the other visitor, and she was lovely beyond belief. Absolutely beautiful and very compassionate. All on her own with only one security guard who was with the nurse. She stayed for around an hour and was obviously a regular. The nurses said she often came in late at night, just slipping in with no fuss or fanfare and staying several hours at a time. I met her several times before my friend finally died, and she was always unfailingly kind and gentle. I summoned up the courage to ask why she did this so much. In those days, gay men, particularly those who were HIV positive, were often sidelined and looked down upon. She was quite matter-of-fact in saying that she felt she could offer something to people who didn't have much else, and it made her feel grounded in what was a very turbulent life. After David had died and I went to collect his belongings, there was a card with a letter in it from her for me. I don't think I'll ever forget it, and I used to get angry with people who took against her. She wasn't perfect, I'm sure, but to me she was a lovely and wonderful lady. To keep up with the general theme and to echo others, Cilla Black was a complete person of the first order, and I don't really know anyone who ever had a good word to say about her. She lived not that far from my parents when I was a teenager and was notorious in the village for her appalling attitudes. Story 6. Met Steve Allen once and he was a total piece of shit. Forgot about it. Decades passed. Then I'm in the theater with my wife watching the Elvis movie, and they made a much bigger deal than the story really warranted about Steve Allen being a condescending asshole to Elvis. After the movie, I was thinking about it and realized that someone probably held on to their own Steve Allen experience for decades and put it into that movie. Story 7. Actually, Diddy came into a very popular place where I worked after closing time. We kept the kitchen open with all of the staff there for his entourage. They came in 45 minutes late, ordered chicken teriyaki, cooked to order, and got up and left without paying because it took too long. World-class piece of shit. And here for all of it. Karma is an absolute bitch. Story 8. Ozzy Osbourne once wandered drunkenly into my workplace, asked to use the bathroom, did not close the door, urinated all over the toilet, and left me with that mess to clean up. Rock and roll, I guess. Story 9. Tommy Lee Jones. I was working as a security guard on the movie shoot for The Hunted. My second week on the job, I was posted in front of Tommy Lee Jones and Benicio del Toro's trailers on this side street in a residential area. Basically, just stand there all day and make sure nobody interferes with anything. Day 1 was fine. I was there all day and never saw Tommy Lee Jones. Benicio came and went throughout the day and was super nice. He even came out and had a chat once. It was surprising because I had just seen him on TV the prior week accepting an Oscar. I congratulated him on that and he was thankful. Just seemed like a decent dude who wasn't arrogant. Day 2 was a different story. I arrived at 10 a.m. and relieved the overnight person. I'm standing there, and this dog comes trotting up to me. Super friendly. I assumed it was a neighborhood dog that got out. It just kind of hung out with me for about 20 minutes until an SUV comes flying down the street and stops right before the barricade. I see an old man hop out of the back. He points and yells, "Hey!" and is walking toward me with a purpose. Get away from my dog. It's at this point that I realize it's Tommy Lee Jones. I put my hands up and I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was your dog." I don't know if he heard me, but he walked right up to me with his driver right behind him, ready to pull him back if he has to. He puts his finger in my chest and says, "Why is she out? Who let my dog out?" I tried to tell him she was out when I got there, and I had no idea it was even his dog. But I was only 20 and just completely scared out of my mind, so I was stuttering and stammering, and he kept interrupting me, demanding answers. By then, a few more of his people had gathered around and someone got a hold of my boss. Then my phone rang, and it was my boss telling me to just go home for the day and it would get handled. I went home and called him later, asking if I should still come in tomorrow. He said, "Nope, you don't work here anymore." I tried explaining everything, but there was no getting through. So, Tommy Lee Jones got me fired from a job for something I was not responsible for. Story 10, BJ. Novak. I used to cook and bartend at a local dive bar when I was in college. He came and did a comedy set for the students. He bombed. It was awful. After the show, I went in for the late night shift. As I was standing there behind the bar clocking in and getting ready to head back to the kitchen, in walks BJ, and sits down at the bar looking completely bummed. Our main bartender goes over to talk to him. He sneered at our menu and asked for things that he knew we would never have. This was where the broke college kids and even more broke townies drank. The fact that we offered more than one vodka was a miracle. He finally picked something, and the bartender asked to see his identification. Keep in mind that this is a college town bar. We carded everyone that ordered a drink, regardless of how old they looked. There were signs saying this in about 8 different places. BJ lost it. He completely blew up on our bartender, cussing him out and saying things like, "Do you know who I am? I'll buy this place and fire the whole staff." Our bartender knew exactly who he was, but was quick enough to say, "You look like some sort of off-brand Seth Meyers. Either show me your identification or get out." He did eventually show his identification and went to sit in some corner. Every now and then he'd make a rude comment to a server walking by. When he tried to order another round, the bartender cut him off and kicked him out. Story 11. I interned at a music management company in college, and one of the clients was Meatloaf. I answered the phone and he asked for his manager. I told him the manager was on a call, and he started screaming, "He's on a conference call? Are you kidding me? I'm Meatloaf." You know what? Forget it. Then hung up. As a 19-year-old trying to get into the music industry, my face went white, thinking my career was over. To his credit, the manager, who had a famously bad temper himself, walked over to me, told me that Meatloaf was a buffoon who nobody respected anymore, and to not worry. Story 12. Bill Cosby was the most egotistical person I've ever met. Billionaire tipped $1 and an autograph and kept looking my trainee, who worked in room service, up and down. Massive main character issues and was a pain to everyone. And the nicest? George Carlin, hands down. Complete gentleman and loved his coffee. God, I miss that guy. It was such a surreal experience to stand there in front of my favorite comedian ever and have a whole conversation with him for about 5 minutes. There he was. I cried afterward. Once in a lifetime experience. Story 13. Met George Lopez at a Dodgers game, complete asshole. Told a buddy who works at the stadium about it, and he was like, "Oh yeah, he's rude to everyone down here and doesn't tip. Forget that guy." Story 14. A relative of mine had an interesting interaction with LaToya Jackson. He was in the same elevator as her in another country. She didn't think he spoke English, so she started talking trash about how dumpy the country was and how much she hated the fans in that country. Then my relative asked her, "So, do you ever go back to Gary?" Apparently, the look on her face was priceless. Story 15. I met Jared Leto in Nashville in the early 2000s with my female friend who was very attractive and also 16. It didn't stop Jared from asking her if she wanted to go have sex in the first few minutes of meeting. She declined and was very grossed out by it, so we left. True story. Story 16. The rudest celebrity I ever met was Jack Nicholson. I asked him for an autograph, and he growled at me that he only signs autographs for chicks with huge tits. On the flip side, the nicest celebrity I ever met was Lemmy Kilmister from Motorhead. I was at a bar and he sat down beside me. I was in awe and stammered, "Let me buy you a drink." He said, "Nah, you can't do that." I was a little dejected and hung my head. He immediately burst out in laughter and said, "Kid, I'm a goddamned rock star. Let me buy you a drink." I then spent the night with Lemmy buying me Long Island iced tea while we talked about 60s British science fiction. Story 17. Danny Masterson. I was an extra in a commercial for that 70s show. I saw him and Wilmer talking during a break, so I walked up and said I had recently seen a VH1 movie he was in, and it was great and I admired his work. He mocked me and said, "It's just TV. It's not real. Don't take it so seriously." Then he rolled his eyes to Wilmer and walked off. I was just trying to give him props for making a good show, and he basically gave me the finger. Forget that guy. Story 18. Dennis Hopper didn't smile once or make eye contact or tip. Not even after he forgot his cell phone and it had to be kept under guard for him for 6 hours. Not even a thank you. Crushed me. Best, Billy Zane. I pull out the Billy Zane story every chance I get, so I'll spare you the long version this time. That guy was a legend. Hung out with us the entire night and came out again the next week just to hang out with us some more. Story 19. I think it's way more funny than rude, but Allen Iverson. I was young, probably 9 to 10 years old. My dad and I were coming back home from a soccer tournament in North Carolina. We stopped at an Applebee's in Newport News for a quick lunch. We walked in, and 3/4 of the restaurant was blocked off with people. My dad goes, "Oh hey, that's Allen Iverson, go say hi." I walk over and say something along the lines of, "Hey, I like basketball, you're really good. Wanted to say hello." And he goes, "Not now, little man. See how many people are up in here?" Story 20. Robin Williams was amazing. I was the graveyard shift manager at a luxury hotel in a big city, and he was a guest with us. He couldn't sleep one night, so he came down to the desk and just hung out and chatted. It was quiet and beautiful at night, and he was a pleasure. He talked about jazz, blues, holiday memories, old teachers that still show up in your dreams, and lots of other things. He got a burst of energy at one point and made us random balloon animals that were just a rooster and a ball. But he kept saying stuff like, "And for you, here's a koala." But it was the same rooster and ball he had just made twice before. Story 21. I used to work in morning television in Chicago, and these were some nice folks I met. Chris Pratt, right after Guardians of the Galaxy came out. He was throwing out the first pitch at Wrigley Field and was nice enough to let me interview him. I'm not an interviewer. I'm a cameraman. The producer was late. Robert Englund. He chatted with a whole bunch of us and told us the importance of drinking a glass of wine. Michael Rooker, he was a gentleman and totally cool with me being a fanboy over him. Bryan Cranston. Met him at an event with my son. He said hello, gave us fist bumps, and took a picture. Regis Philbin, super cool and down to earth. Nick Offerman, a gentleman and was filming Parks and Recreation, so he was in full Ron Swanson gear. John Heatercool was down to do a bit with us. Chris Hardwick chatted with me, very nice. Rudest. Pauly Shore was a total jerk and couldn't have been less interested in being on our show. Story 22. No surprise, but Bill Cosby, a few months before all the allegations came out, did a show at the place I worked at. He refused to do sound and lighting checks or even leave his dressing room before the show. When the show started, he came out and berated the sound and lighting guys for about 15 minutes until it was to his liking. It wasn't like a humorous thing. It was him basically yelling at the techs while the crowd kind of looked on in horror. He was also very difficult with all of us crew. My bosses took their job seriously because on a small show like that, we might make $5,000 in profit after all the bills were settled. We had pictures in our lobby of all the past performers. Cosby had performed before, but a few days after the show, we took down his picture in the lobby. On a side note, someone stole the picture of Bill Clinton we had hanging up. Zac Brown Band was probably one of the nicest groups to come through while I was there. They were nice and respectful to all of us local crew and even invited some of the students that were in the building on stage during sound check to get autographs and hang out for a few minutes.